Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek for Breakthrough News, and this is Dispatches. As the violence across Israel-Palestine continues to escalate, to help us make sense of it, I'm joined by Israeli journalist for Haaretz, Amira Hass, who spent years reporting from both Gaza and the West Bank, as well as living there. Amira, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So you are in Ramallah right now in the West Bank. Before we go into everything else, can you just give us an idea of what it's like there at the moment?
There was a general strike announced today in the West Bank, and I think they're also in Palestinian towns in Israel. And there was a huge demonstration here in Ramallah in protest of Israeli aggression against Gaza.
And, you're one of, I think, the few public dissidents remaining in Israel that we hear from in English, at least. So I'm curious, what's that like? Do you feel safe? And how did you become so outspoken?
Oh, that's a real derail from our subject.
Before we get into the subject, I'm just curious about this because,
We are not so, the fact that you don't hear in English doesn't mean that there are not more dissidents here in Israel. Israelis who are dissidents, but true, it's not enough. It's never enough. And people are active in universities, in working places, other than those of us who are lucky to have this venue of writing at a newspaper. There are some websites which are dissident websites, news websites, and they bring much more information and Palestinian voices that the mainstream allows. So we do exist. And I think in general we are safe. In general, it is frightening. The Israeli fascist right wing is getting stronger and bolder, and they are threatening. Though right now, of course, their main target are Palestinians in Israel and not us. But some people have been confronted, have faced, the rage of Israeli right-wing rioters. Some journalists, even from the mainstream, were in danger because this right-wing fascist messianic right-wing wants to punish them for saying the very little that they say. I talk about the mainstream. But in general, so far, to be a dissident in Israel or to voice different opinions or to bring information which doesn't fit the general narrative is not dangerous, which only says that it's very troubling that not more people are joining and not more people are breaking their silence, because we don't. We are not in danger of losing our job or losing our liberty or certainly not our life. So this is the situation. So we are not heroes. We do what we do because it's enraging and because it has to be done, but you're not talking about heroes here.
Well, thank you for explaining that to us. And now to get into Gaza. You have observed past wars on Gaza. You have lived in Gaza. You observed the one in 2014. How does the war that we're witnessing right now compare? I hear a lot of Palestinians on the ground in Gaza are saying the airstrikes are more intense. It feels scarier. Yeah. What's your view on it so far?
It's something that you would never believe yourself that you say that, but it can be worse. And this year they started immediately with bombing. Israel started immediately with the bombing and shelling of huge high buildings, multi-story buildings. It does warn the people to leave immediately their place. But still, the sight of it and the impact to the neighboring houses and the impact in terms of dust and smoke is really bad and frightening, and also the damage to the infrastructure that comes with the bombardment of buildings without casualties, but there are always casualties. At the same time, Israel is targeting people, of course. It claims that they all have to do with the Palestinian armed groups. But it turns out that there are so many civilians and so many children. If I'm not, if it hasn't risen so far, it's 212 people by now, and children are around. It's 61 children, and I believe that 40 women. So you already have more around a half, which are certainly have nothing to do with the armed forces, Palestinian armed forces, and I'm sure that many of the other men have nothing to do with it. So while Israel claims that it is that these bombardments are surgical, it is not. There are many civilians involved.
Of course. And
And
I'm
as a
curious.
whole, the very concept that every person who has arms or is connected to an armed group and stays at home and you may kill him at home is an absurd, because if we follow this rule, this engagement rule, then almost every building in Israel is
Right.
worthy of being bombed. I
Right.
mean,
Even in the
by
US.
this rule, because in every house in Israel you have somebody who is a soldier, and
Yeah.
certainly somebody who is a high officer in the army or in the Israeli security services, etc. So this criteria that has developed by the Israeli army, justifying its massive bombardment and targeting of all Palestinian infrastructure and residential areas, is really enraging.
That's a really good point. I mean, you could even make the same argument about the US if you want to make the argument that there's, we have military bases everywhere in residential
Yeah,
neighborhoods and
exactly.
cities.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty
yeah,
routine and normal. So you could imagine if that logic was applied the other way around, it would not be acceptable.
yeah.
Um, I'm curious, is there any opposition in Israel to the carnage? How is it being covered in the Israeli media? And I'm not just talking about Gaza. I mean, all of this escalation, right? It started in
Yeah.
Jerusalem with Sheikh Jarrah, and escalations and provocations against the al-aqsa mosque. And then now we're seeing these photos of children being pulled out of rubble in Gaza. How does that get covered in the Israeli media?
Let me start by that still we should not forget that Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza are also launching rockets at
Right.
Israel. And
Yes.
certainly they don't have the capacities that Israel has, but still they do instill fear. And in the areas, in the communities and kibbutzim around Gaza, people's life is actually paralyzed as well, and many had to leave. And people do get killed by those those rockets. I just now read that two
Foreign workers, I
migrant
think.
workers,
Yes.
two migrant workers were just killed by Palestinian missile. So it is not. It is a war, and it has two sides. But of course, when we look, and also Palestinians do target civilian areas. So it's not this should not be overlooked. But at the same time, we have to see the things in context. And this time, what people feel is that Hamas stepped into the context of Israeli very specific Israeli tactics of expelling Palestinians from their houses and neighborhoods in Jerusalem in order to make room for Israeli Jews. So it's actually a Jewish settlement. They are preparing a new Jewish settlement, which will be in the heart of a Palestinian area in East Jerusalem. And this is something that has been going on for, if we talk about the 67 occupied territory, it has been going on since 67.
Right.
So 53 years or 54 years. So there is nothing new about it. But somehow you always have there are, you always wonder why there is not a general protest about another such wrongdoing, and all of a sudden there is an outrage, and all of a sudden Sheikh Jarrah, the situation in Sheikh Jarrah did attract attention all around.
I
There
guess
is a
that.
demonstration. Yes, there is a clash nearby, and
Is
there
that
are
a home?
ambulances now. Yeah, I live near a checkpoint, and
I
there is a
see.
clash now after it developed after the demonstration. Yeah,
And we'll get to
uh,
that because there has been, right, there's been, I think, it hasn't gotten as much attention, but there's been, I think, something like 12 Palestinians have been killed. There's
already
been
19. I
attacks,
saw from the
right?
beginning there have been 19 people who were
Wow.
killed. Yeah,
Okay.
in the West Bank. In the
Wow.
West Bank.
Which of
Uh,
course is a smaller number than the over 200 in Gaza, but it's still
that's
quite a high
yeah, yeah,
number.
yeah.
Um,
It is.
but you were saying the international, and I
So
kind of,
Hamas
yeah.
stepped in during a month, a month of Ramadan. I'm sure that many of your listeners know that it is a special month, and people fast, and people are engaged in those who are more religious are engaged in more religious introversion, and then the evening when they break the fast, it's a family event, and Israel managed from the start to break the joy of this month, the joy and the reflectivity of this month completely during some aggression of police towards youth in East Jerusalem, and then very brutal invasions into the Haram al-Sharif
Mhm.
and into al-Aqsa esplanade. And even the sight, and I'm not a religious person, but the sight of those Israeli police breaking in with their heavily uniformed, heavily armed, and with stun grenades and all the rest is really shocking for everybody. So, and this drew the attention of Palestinians in Israel and Muslims in Israel and in all over the historical Palestine, but also, of course, of Muslims all over the world. So, this kind of stupidity shows us it is stupidity, but it is an inbuilt stupidity, which shows the complete contempt to Palestinian feelings and to Palestinian religiosity and Palestinian sacred places. I just want to imagine how Israelis would have reacted if somebody broke in, some foreign army broke in into a Jewish synagogue. And then it went on to Sheikh Jarrah. And Sheikh Jarrah is a long saga of actually since 72, but in the last 15 years, when the Jewish communities that claim that, or Jewish uh, uh, organizations that claim that they own the land, and that's why the Palestinians have to leave it. So it has gained attention since 15 years,
Mhm.
but not enough attention.
Right.
I used to go to some of the demonstrations protesting the eviction of the people, but Israeli judges felt very secure to judge, to rule in favor of those Jewish committees or Jewish organizations that claim that they own the land, disregarding completely the rights of the people who have been living there since 1956,
Mhm.
and disregarding completely the fact that those families who live in Sheikh Jarrah are themselves refugees, and they have houses in which today Jewish families live. This is in the area that became Israel. So all this together, I think it brought together all, like it made the Israeli occupation and settler colonialism, it condensed it in a nutshell.
Mhm.
And this nutshell all of a sudden was visible to so many people. And Hamas knew to take the opportunity and to intervene with their rockets. Now we can argue about it,
Mm.
and I'm not sure. I'm not a fan of these very phallic stages of struggles, whether it's Palestinian phallus or the Israeli Jewish phallus, but they in a way they said, if Israel doesn't listen to anything else, that's what we are going to do.
Mhm.
Of course, the Hamas wants to be a political factor and to be a political to have a political weight in the region, and it gains it through its militarization, and we have to realize that. Yeah.
And I mean, you wrote about the Palestinian Authority canceling the elections. How much of a role did that play, do you think? And I mean, we could just speculate here, but like, do you think there was a calculation there because the elections were canceled, Hamas getting involved? I mean, and why were the elections canceled? Why did the Palestinian Authority cancel the elections? Let's start from there.
Look, we were all surprised that from the start that they were announced in the first place.
Yeah.
So we don't know why Abu Mazen decided to have them. It wasn't really pressure from the outside. Maybe he and his associates did not imagine, could not figure out that they were so how would I say, not respected by the general public, and they did not realize that they will actually split into three different lists of Fatah.
Mm-hmm.
And that the people do not have confidence in this PA, and with the time it evolved. It became clear that this would be reflected in the elections. Is it necessarily that Hamas would have been the main to gain? We don't know, because it's very likely that Hamas would have received more votes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would be a big, not more votes, but it would have been the biggest slate, because they are very organized and they don't have competing organizations. But at the same time, those who are not with political Islam had a big variety of groups, of slates to vote for, of lists to vote for. So anyway, we believe that I'm not the only one, that the Jerusalem issue and the fact that Israel said it would not allow the PA to conduct the elections there, it was a pretext in order to cancel the elections. After in Fatah they understood that they are going to turn out ridiculous in this election. Yeah. Not to lose, because people still would vote for them, but to turn out ridiculous.
They would look bad.
And the Jerusalem pretext was indeed very cynical, because this could have turned into an opportunity that all, except of Fatah, official Fatah, all groups wanted. It could have been an opportunity for a mass civil disobedience to Israeli authorities. Okay, Palestinians could have run the elections without Israeli permission. You are under occupation. Why do you have to look for Israel's permission? But that's something that Abu Mazen opted against, and thus serving the interest, or actually getting close to Israeli way of thinking. And Hamas again came into this. Yes, please.
No, finish. I'm sorry. Finish your thought.
No.
I wanted to ask about
I don't know to what extent Hamas are connecting this to. It's true that they said things about the elections, but I tend to believe that they are also comfortable without the elections, because it allows them to remain in Gaza without a competitor and to maintain their rule over Gaza.
And then how much do you think Israeli internal politics played into this escalation, at least from the Israeli side? Because, you have Netanyahu facing these corruption charges, preventing an alternative government from being formed. And it does seem like he is benefiting from what's happening now. Do you think that that's played a role in the Israeli calculations and how they've dealt with this issue?
Uh, I'm not such an expert of Netanyahu, but friends of my colleagues of mine in Israeli in Haaretz and probably other media say that there is a connection, that he allowed this escalation to develop and did not contain it, assuming that it would benefit his desire to remain prime minister and to avoid his trial, because he's on trial. So to avoid or to postpone it as much as possible. I believe this is true. It has a role, but there is, as a friend of mine that we just discussed it, but there is the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that that's inherent to Israeli policies.
Mm-hmm.
The Sheikh Jarrah is Israeli policy. The invasion, the breaking into the al-aqsa is Israeli policies. So we can settler colonialism is part of Israeli DNA. So we cannot really explain everything just by ad hoc circumstantial realities of Netanyahu.
That's a good point. You wrote recently, I want to move to Jerusalem for a moment. You wrote recently in late April that the right-wing Jerusalem thugs, you called them, are an arm of the state. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? And I think that's important in the context of what's taking place across other Israeli cities at the moment. But can you elaborate on what you mean by they're an arm of the state?
I said the privatized arm.
Yeah, privatized arm of the
Yes,
state.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Look, we tend to think about violence as something exceptional or sudden or occasional. But one has to understand that Palestinians live under an ongoing practice of violence against them. And the violence is not expressed only in physical violence, that you can see the bruises or broken glasses or broken head or whatever. You have a violence which is a big power that violates your rights, your space, your history, your identity by all kind of means. And Israeli means, usually the Israeli violent means are bureaucratic. You know, it's Palestinians don't have a permit to build a house, or Palestinians don't have a permit to live in the West Bank. Palestinians who live outside, and Israel bars Palestinians in Gaza from reaching the West Bank. This is all violence. This is all state violence. I'm talking long before we reach the state violence that is being expressed now in Gaza in its extreme, or the smaller scale violence of soldiers breaking into Palestinian houses every night, and the Israeli raids and etc. All this violence is used in order to repress a people, that is demanding rights in this country. Mm-hmm. And this demanding that its identity and its history in this place and future in this place be respected. So what happened, that Israel has ignored the requests of Palestinian political groups all over like in the past 30 years, that were ready to have some kind of a compromise, a painful compromise, but still something that will show respect to the Palestinian demands and history in the place. And Israel rejected this. And each time we have this escalation because Israel doesn't listen. Mm-hmm. So it's like Palestinians want to use a louder voices in order to make Israelis listen. I know I deviated from the privatized arm. So what happened is that parallel to events in Sheikh Jarrah and al-Aqsa, right-wing leaders kind of triggered or called for many young Israelis, mostly religious, either settlers from the West Bank or more orthodox religious youth, to come and demonstrate against the Palestinians and to clash with them, and this was very frightening. And everybody, spoke about their violence. Like, so they are young, they are, they have their hormones, they are frustrated, they are from deprived families, or I don't know, all kind of, again, circumstantial reasons. So I felt a need to say that this is just like the settlers, violent settlers in the West Bank that attack Palestinians in order to force them to leave their land in the West Bank. So they are a privatized arm of Israeli official state bureaucratic violence, and so are the youth in Jerusalem that we saw in Jerusalem. So violence can be expressed in what we know physical violence, but the systemic violence that Israel uses is very much is exercised by regulations, by laws, by discrimination, by attitudes. It doesn't have to be expressed only in physical harm.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me a lot of the US actually, and its history, and having these kind of
Yeah.
like privatized militias on the ground that terrorize almost like as a force multiplier for the police in the past. But, you know, moving on to the Palestinian side of things, are you surprised by the mobilization of Palestinian citizens of Israel, like first in Sheikh Jarrah, which is Jerusalem, but then also throughout the country? I mean, have you ever seen that before? Is it unprecedented?
No. It is, to a large extent. It is. I'm surprised and not surprised, because we always, everybody who comes from the left, we always wait for people who are oppressed or groups that are oppressed to resist.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, we are always surprised that people tolerate injustice for many reasons, and I don't blame, of course, but I always say that Palestinians have a lot of patience and tolerance, and sometimes it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, I'm not surprised, because we always expect something to break out like this. What I do say, I must say that I'm surprised is by how intense it was, and that actually it was in many parts, as far as I understand, it was people who are not necessarily political. I know that there are some outlaw people who are in the fringes of the law, who participated, and it got some ugly expressions, and this is I think it happens everywhere.
Yes.
I don't think it represents, but it does got some ugly, by lynching, by stoning people, but also Israeli right-wingers, Jewish right-wingers were as violent, and I don't compare the violence. And there was a lot of vandalism, which is also, the vandalism again expresses the rage that has been accumulated over so many years. So yes, I would say the big picture, I'm not surprised, but you're surprised that it happens. When it happens, you for the moment you are surprised. Then it looks very logical.
Yeah, I mean, and then on the other end of it, there's, Palestinian citizens of Israel in many cities are saying that they're very scared because there's these extremist settler mobs
Sure.
organizing to attack them, and the police are either standing idly by or protecting the
Yes.
mobs. So have you ever seen that sort of response by settler mobs inside like inside the Green Line, inside Israel,
No,
attacking Arab
that's,
civilians?
what we understood is that the clashes really came to a um, were especially severe in several what the so-called mixed towns where
Mhm.
Palestinians and Jews live, and were just recently or in the past 10 years um, settlers or people who are actually belong to the settler movement or have or share the same ideology moved to live within the Palestinian neighborhoods, and doing two things at the same time: being part of a movement of gentrification, which
Mhm.
is very abusive, as we know from many other places. So gentrification and claiming this as a Jewish area. So they actually exported the same frame of mind of settlers in the West Bank to those cities. And this frame of mind is I would call it an expelling state of mind, because what has developed over the 50 years of Israeli settlement in the West Bank is that there is a growing, you hear more and more Israeli Jews who are settlers or who support the settlers, who envision a repetition of the Nakba, who envision a reality where Israel can complete 1948 and expel Palestinians. And in practice, what they have done, it's not only, again, the settlers, again, are the privatized arm, but it's in combination of Israel and the settlers. They have deprived Palestinians in the West Bank of 60% of their space in the West Bank, and the same thing in Jerusalem. So this vector of Israelis leading to condensing Palestinians in enclaves, be they in the West Bank or in Jerusalem or in Israel proper, uh, the next step of this is expulsion from the country. And
Mhm.
this is a danger that we see gets stronger with the developments, with the process, with this reality. So yes, this settler mob that came to together with others inside Israel represents or reflects a very dangerous escalation in the ideology, in the colonialist ideology of Israelis.
Yeah, and this is gonna, I think, I mean, do you see this continuing after Gaza? Like this seems like a separate issue from it seems like it exploded in this stage of Palestinians protesting or rioting inside Israel. But do you think it'll stop when the Gaza war is over, or it'll
You know,
continue?
we are not prophets, but look, things will calm down. They already are. There is already less. I mean, this stage of clashes and direct clashes somehow I understand is subsiding. Um, it is now the time when the Palestinians have um, to think again about their leaders, because leaderships, because the vandalism is also an expression of the lack of leadership, or the weakness of Palestinians' leaderships inside Israel. Um, what we see here is that all the seams between inside the historical Palestine, all these separations that Israel has been so meticulously built between Palestinians in all the places, Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, Israel, all this uh, is uh, is falling
Yeah.
is falling. And Palestinians come out as a people, in historical Palestine. How this will develop, it's up to them. And I only hope, because I know that wars and militarization uh, are a dangerous stage, because in wars, in total wars, the extreme right wing can achieve much more than when there is no war. So my
Right.
suggestion is not automatically to conclude from here that the only solution is a war against Israel, because it isn't. Uh, I believe that if I see other liberation movements, I guess that there will be a return to um, to build up a political to renew the Palestinian political movement.
Hmm.
That will probably or hopefully be represent all the Palestinians, not separate groups, separate splitted, fragmented communities, but the people as a whole. This is what I hear from people here. This is the aim. This is the goal, but it's not something that can happen overnight. Still, the waves of protest and um, of the past month or so, and the tragedy in Gaza, because we cannot forget that this is the people in Gaza pay a terrible price for this. But it might hasten, it might push and bolster this process of building up Palestinian politics anew.
And then on the Israeli side, I mean, okay, so one thing that's interesting is that Hamas has definitely demonstrated a stronger military capability than it had in 2014. I imagine there's probably conversations taking place among Israelis about this is really scary, right? There's like rockets there's rockets being fired at Tel Aviv like every day. Imagine how it would be if there was a war with Hezbollah. It would probably be way worse. So I'm curious, what lessons do you think and this is more speculation, I'm asking you to be a prophet, I guess, but what lessons do you think that the Israeli government and military will draw from this current escalation?
Um, I want to believe, or I want to hope, that Israelis will learn the lesson and will understand that it's a political issue and we have to discuss it and to I don't like the term solve, because you don't, I mean, but to address these political issues in a political way, and to uh, acknowledge that Palestinians, in spite of all the repression and oppression over this more than seven decades, are not giving up and are not becoming less Palestinian, even if they are Israeli citizens. Um, I don't see it happening. I mean, I want to hope. And I think that all the work of many of the dissidents that we spoke about before is towards this, trying to convince more Israelis that we completely have to change our the way we relate to the fact that there is a Palestinian people living in this country, living and the indigenous population of this country. But from experience and from knowing that the Israeli society has moved very much to the right wing over the past 25 years, I believe that the change can be only if there is tremendous pressure from the outside,
Mm-hmm.
pressure on Israel from from other countries, which means that they have to understand how dangerous Israel has become. I mean, in Israeli society, it's not just Israeli society is which supports these right-wing parties and right-wing governments and right-wing policies and is part of the settler colonial process that is ongoing, and shows its racism against Palestinians, it is a very dangerous society because it lives in a neighborhood which is Arab and Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
We live in this neighborhood, and we all the time act as if we are against it, not as if we act as people who are against it.
You know,
Um,
with what you mentioned about the right wing, I did want to ask you, we talked a little bit before about these right wing groups in Jerusalem. You have, groups like Lahava, right? And then there's the Kahanists are gaining more power politically thanks to Netanyahu. But how much support do these ideologies, do people like this Knesset member, Itamar Ben Gvir, it's very right wing, how much support does their ideology actually have in Israeli society? Is their influence in politics disproportionate
yeah.
to the actual influence they have in Israel?
When I talk about right wing, I don't talk just about two or three members of Knesset. Uh, all the parties that were center to right have become right wing. For me, right wing is the also labor has the Labor Party has actually in the past 30 years since Oslo has implemented a right-wing policy. When I mean right-wing means that to deprive Palestinians of their land. This is right-wing for me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just two or three people or two or three parliament members. Israeli courts, Israeli prosecution, Israeli police are all siding with settlers, or actually allow settlers to inflict violence all over the West Bank and do nothing about it. And this is only growing. I mean, it can grow only because the right wing is so strong, the right wing thinking, which means people or an ideology which puts Jews as the Herrenrasse, as we are the masters of the place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Only ideology that fosters our privileges and makes it into an ideology that we are supreme here, that we are superior. So I'm not at all talking just about a few people or a few groups. I'm talking about how this chauvinist thinking has deepened in Israeli society, in education, in schools. When you listen to children, I mean, when you listen to children in the street, the way they speak about Arabs, when you have Israeli ministries and Israeli official ministries that discriminate Palestinians against as a matter of a policy. So this is right wing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always interesting how in the West, at least in the US, I can speak for the US, there's this trend among younger people to be more left, right? It's the younger generation is moving more to the left, and in Israel it seems to be the opposite, where there's a move where younger people are actually becoming more right wing, which isn't their fault necessarily. It definitely
It
speaks
is,
to
it is right wing when we say it is racist. It is an ideology that comes to protect our privileges, the
right.
privilege of the Jews. So any compromise here, any progress, or any attempt to prevent a total collapse of the place has to be involved with Israelis renouncing their privileges and understanding that things have to be shared here.
Mm-hmm.
It can be manifested in many ways, but we will have to give up our privileges in order to live in a place where the two peoples have their rights. But these Israelis cannot imagine even.
Do you so you talk about like without outside pressure from other countries, perhaps countries that are of course supporting and arming Israel, unless that comes from the outside, it's not going to happen from the inside. Um, so I'm curious what happens. There say this continues, which it kind of seems like this is what's going to happen. But say this continues, this unconditional support from the West. There's no red lines. Israel can just kind of behave as it wants to, continue on this right-wing trajectory, bomb Gaza, push Palestinians out more and more without any red lines. Where does this go?
Well, I have to throw back the ball to your yard, to your court. Um, Look, we do hear about some changes still in the American public opinion, and also within the Democratic Party. I know it's very far, it's very distant, and I'm just as frustrated when I realize that in Europe, Western Europe, there is a huge gap between the policy of the governments and the mood that we see among demonstrators who support Palestinians. Um, Look, I mean, we have to continue. What can I say? Our talk here, I would have rather preferred to read or speak with my friends than to have this interview. But this is all part of our attempts to build up a change. Now,
Yeah.
it's very frustrating, but
Well, this was gonna be my. I'm glad you mentioned the Democrats because this is gonna be my last question for you. Is you're probably seeing the conversation happening in the U.S. and I will say I think this is the first time I can, in my lifetime at least, and probably ever, that you've had this much dissent against U.S. policy towards Israel coming out of the U.S. Congress, even if it's just 5 or 6 people. That's a very big deal here. And then you have this debate taking place about where the word apartheid is being used openly. Human Rights Watch had a report out. B'Tselem had a report out. You have Congress people saying this is apartheid. Does that debate happening in the U.S. reverberate in Israeli media, in Israeli society? Does that make a difference that debate is even being had in the U.S. among American officials?
I must say I don't listen much to Israeli TV or radio. I cannot tolerate it. It makes me, especially in these times, I cannot listen to
I
it.
can only imagine.
So yeah, so I depend on what I read at Haaretz, which is not a model for Israeli mainstream media. But these things are being, I understand. I guess that they are, but they're not taken as serious as they should.
So
They're not
until
taken
something
as seriously.
concrete,
Yeah.
until an American president.
Until there will be, but so far they still count on their strength. A friend of mine just wrote to me, said, how could the Security Council vote against Israel, where half or more than half of its members buy arms from Israel?
Right. Right.
So it's we are when you come from a left wing, even like myself, communist background, there's always this kind of psyche in you that says, oh, if people come out and struggle, then the struggle must succeed at the end.
Yeah.
And that the power of the people is stronger, is bigger than the power of regimes. But unfortunately, it's not true.
Well, actually, now you mentioned communism, so now I have to raise this. What where is the left in not just Israel, but what left do you see in Palestine in the time that you spent in Palestine? And obviously you're Israeli. Why does it seem like there's no left on these sides? And maybe, I mean, this is probably part of an international
It is.
trend, right? Where like the left is just
Yeah.
becoming smaller and smaller, but specific to Israel and Palestine, where's the left?
Look, the Palestinian left has shrunk over the years. and also the Israeli non-Zionist and anti-Zionist left has shrunk over the years. Um, um, I think it's a big question now, and I'm sorry because I'm getting messages from my paper. They want me to write something,
Oh, no, no,
so
no,
we'll
no
have,
worries.
yeah.
We can wrap up. Yeah, yeah, we
I
can.
don't know.
That was a
Yes,
that
we'll
was
have
a
to
big
wrap up.
question. That
It's
was a
not.
big
It's a
question.
big question, and it needs a lot of. It has many ramifications. I can say that the main message of left wing, which is to uh, to disregard ethnicities or national borders, and to see the world through the glasses or the angle of oppressed against oppressors. Uh, this does not have so much appeal in national struggles.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So in national struggles, and also the it has failed. The Soviet Union was a terrible model for left wing wingers all over the world. It seemed like it helped liberation movements outside of the Soviet Union, but in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet bloc, it was a prison of all the peoples there. It was a huge prison of the peoples in there. So we are still paying for the big loss of or the big of the shape of that communism received in those areas, and in Asia too. So I guess we need much more to discuss this than
Yeah,
our
perhaps for
talk here.
perhaps for
Yes,
another
yeah,
time. But Amira Hass,
yes.
Israeli journalist for Haaretz, thank you so much for joining us today,
You're welcome.
helping us understand this violence. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye.